Welcome to this new year. I never thought either GCCMC or COVID is going to last through a third year, but it's behaving. And in 100 years after the influenza virus first showed us what a pandemic is, we are learning that 100 years later we are no different in the way we handle pandemics. And pandemics are showing us a way that whatever we propose, they dispose. So here we are in the new year, looking at a lot of information, most of it not peer-reviewed, most of it with no evidence-based, most of it, as we were talking before we went live, based on emotion rather than evidence, to the point where even the CDC is ballparking it. So what do we need? We need wisdom. And that's what our panel brings in. We have a really, really wonderful panel that stayed through this pandemic. And for all the people who've joined in and then subsequently seen it on YouTube and been sharing it and telling us that GCCMC is actually worth its life. We have this panel that's led by Dr. Gafur. He's been the masterhead. He's been the person who steered it, who's kept our panelists very honest and kept all of us honest. And I will leave him to introduce this amazing panel. And I'm looking forward to 90 minutes of wisdom more than anything else. I can't trust data and evidence anymore, so I trust the wisdom that you bring in. Abdul, all yours.
Thank you, Krishna. Good evening. We are now 2 years into the pandemic. Really 2 years. There is no individual in the world that hasn't felt the devilish hands of the COVID virus. Millions have succumbed to the virus. Hundreds of millions are thrown into poverty. Over-enthusiastic measures will further ruin the economy, and inaction will kill more people. And the virus keeps on changing its appearance every day. This meeting is our 5th webinar on the COVID series. We had discussed several aspects of the pandemic, ranging from virology, epidemiology, clinical, social, economic, and political perspectives. And now we have the Omicron, which is a highly transmissible COVID variant that is now generating a massive wave in our country. Our eminent panelists will share their views on tackling the Omicron wave and several other essential issues that need policymakers and public's attention. We have Dr. Jacob John, Dr. Shamika Ravi, Dr. Aksa Sheikh, Dr. Rajiv Jayadevan, and Dr. Anand Ban. Anand Ban will be joining by 8:30. Now, to begin with, all panelists will give a brief introduction on specific topics, and then we'll have a detailed panel discussion. Dr. Jacob John will tell us, should we COVID vaccinate our children? This is a very important topic and topic of discussion today. Sir, over to you.
Thank you, Abdul Ghafoor. Am I audible?
Yes, sir.
Yes, sir.
Okay, right. Before I go into the specific pediatric issues, first of all, I don't have any hands-on experience. I'm armchair expert. All I have is wisdom that I will bring, as Krishna said. Before I go into the specific issue, I want to tell you the way I look at Omicron. Hello? All right?
Yeah, sir. Please carry.
Okay. The alpha, beta, gamma, delta variants they are independently mutated from the Wuhan D614G, the founder variant of the pandemic. And each variant evolved in some different geographic location, and the mutations are stepwise. 1, 2, 3, 4 mutations. When it came to Omicron, what is the proximal parent? It's not alpha, beta, gamma, delta. It is not the founder variant. We do not know the proximate parent. And today's announcement from OIE, I'm sure people would have known this quite some time, that the most plausible hypothesis is that the coronavirus went into some animal species, and about 10 or 11 animal species are susceptible to infection that we all know. Many of them circulating the virus among those animals. And the mutations are peculiar and numerous, and it looks as if it is adapted to some other species of a host. And it has come back to humans. The OIE statement today is that they have not found any virus that is related to Omicron in any animal species, but there is a claim from one group that has looked at its mutations and focused on rodents as the possible animal species in which this grew, and it's looks like a rodent adapted Omicron that has come back to humans. If that is so, what I'm saying is that this Omicron is a second pandemic. Okay, so if this second pandemic had not come, which is a very wishful thinking, it had not come, the earlier alpha, beta, gamma, delta variants were on their way out. Many countries had reached endemic stage. The longest is India, 24, 25 weeks. Next was Taiwan, about 16 or 18 weeks. Then was Japan, about 10 or 11, 12 weeks. Then was Israel, about 6 weeks. And then Omicron came. And all of these countries and every other country that had not reached endemic are having the current wave of Omicron. Technically, it is SARS-CoV-2 because it is B.1 series, but it is so far removed, it is B.1, 0.1529. So the Omicron is something that was quite, what shall I say, it doesn't fit into the rest of the pandemic and the mutational lineages. Okay, so be that as it may, children. All previous variants and first wave of India, second wave of India, and 3 or 4 or 5 waves in other countries, all have a small proportion of affected as children. And these proportions are not easily counted and put into perspective. There are many publications. The bottom line is a small number of children are severely affected with mortality, maybe about 3% in the first wave, about 8% in the second wave in the United States. In the Indian publication from AIMS, looking at 400 and odd children spread throughout the age range, infancy right up to 18 years, and about 4% mortality. So it is not a trivial problem for children, although the vast majority of children do not suffer very much. in addition to the acute illness that can be devastating for a few children, there is this multi-system inflammatory syndrome in children. That is another problem. Even though the original infection disease was mild, you could still have MIS-C. Long COVID in older children, well recognized. And new diabetes, type 1 and type 2 diabetes in children is another problem that people are now recognizing in increasing numbers. The information is in the ProMed mail a couple of days ago. And up to the Delta time, vaccination protected against all of these. Omicron's pediatric problems have not come out in public domain as yet. However, since Omicron disease is a fundamentally different pathology, pathogenesis than the Delta and the previous variant, we expect that it probably would be quite mild. I hope I don't have to explain why it is fundamentally different. If you want, Abdul, you ask me, I will explain that to you. So ultimately, do children require vaccination? Yes, of course, children do require vaccination for two reasons. One, as I described, it's not a trivial disease. Mortality may be low, but children do suffer. You have MIS-C, you have long COVID, you have diabetes. All these are preventable with vaccination. So vaccination is a necessity for pediatric age group, and epidemiologically, it's a necessity for the whole community. You cannot leave one segment out from vaccination and let them have any amount of infection, and it will bounce back to the rest of the adults. But there is a caveat. The risk of disease being low in children, the risk of vaccine adverse event should be far lower than what we accept in adults with high risk of COVID, severe COVID, hospitalization, and mortality. There, you will accept a certain amount of certain degree of adverse reaction, whereas in children, you will not tolerate that, because left unvaccinated, children by and large will do well. So you cannot use any vaccine that has recognizable serious adverse events of any magnitude. So in the West, they are using vaccines, but there they are able to identify adverse events very quickly and manage them. There is wide knowledge among the medical profession. So there, your risk in children is measured, and they are moving down from 18 to 12 to now 6 in order to avoid pathology in children and as a community response. The virus will become endemic, so we'll need these interventions for a long time. So I don't think you can avoid vaccinating children. If so, start early. So in short, I'm advocating that children be vaccinated, but carefully, wisely, and without putting them at any risk of severe adverse reaction. The the Covaxin group, Bharat Biotech has done safety and immunogenic efficacy, looking at immune responses in 175 children 2 to 5, 175 6 to 12, and 175 12 to 18. And the among them, the tolerability was well established. Immune response has been well established, quite high immune response, both antibody Th2 response and Th1 cell-mediated immunity. So here is one vaccine which seems to be quite safe and quite immunogenic. The other internationally used vaccines are not that safe. So safety-wise, I will have no worries in bringing the age down from 15 to 18 to 15, 15 to 12, 12 to 10, 6, 5, even up to 2. The protein vaccines, that is the spike protein vaccines like Novavax or Corvovax in India and Corvovax, will likely to be equally safe. So that we'll have to wait and see. So I would hesitate to give any other vaccine to children at this moment in time without knowing far more about the serious adverse reactions. So stringent requirement for safety and then widening the age group for vaccination. This would be my take on pediatric vaccination. Back to you, Abdul Ghaffur. You're muted.
Dr. Jacob John is very clear about his opinion on pediatric vaccination. Children should be vaccinated, but carefully, wisely, and we need very safe vaccine. And the pediatric vaccine that we use in our country today is Covaxin, and that's one of the safest vaccine available today for our kids. We will discuss the topic in detail during our panel discussion. Next, Dr. Shamika Ravi, who is an eminent economist, and today Shamika ji will tell us how we can save our economy from the Omicron wave. Shamika ji.
Thank you, Dr. Ghaffur. Thank you for inviting me again. I always enjoy this forum. And I think the words used in the beginning were absolutely right, that you keep us grounded and honest. I think there is so much noise currently that I can imagine, and so much uncertainty, that it is not just in the, in decisions vis-a-vis the infection and vaccination, but also economic policy making, not just at central level, but even localized. I think there's so much rule of thumb, that is working right now, that wisdom, what we spoke about in the beginning, is eventually what is, carrying local governments and national governments through. On the economy front, I would say, given the global economy and the volatility that Omicron has induced globally, there is, for the Indian case, there is reason to be cautiously optimistic. This is generally clear from the kind of growth forecast that several multilateral institutions like the IMF, World Bank, etc., credit rating institutions, etc., have come out for India, which is largely based on the vaccination drive. The fact that once people are vaccinated or a minimum number threshold is vaccinated, there is less fear. Though, of course, it is coming at a time when the vaccination now being opened for children is also happening simultaneously with the third wave and this new variant coming in. This is adding to the uncertainty. But by and large, of course, we should never forget that we are a resource poor economy. That for $2,000 per capita per year, we have the aspirations of OECD countries. We want to do everything that the other countries are doing, and yet resource constraint is not just in terms of not having adequate money, or it's also state capacity, and at the local level, how soon and how quickly we can roll out. Thankfully, the public at large has been largely compliant. Now we can quibble about masking and adequate, protocol following and so on and so forth, but we have not seen the kind of belligerent vaccine hesitancy which many, of the richer countries you are seeing rioting on the back of mandatory vaccination, etc., happen in relatively progressive economies like Germany. It's not only limited to the US, which is mostly visible, but we are seeing this kind of rioting happen in Netherlands. We are seeing in many other Western European countries, etc. So we are not faced with that kind of vaccine resistance. I think largely for us, it is a problem of really resource constraint that we are struggling against. On the economic front, the inflation, right now, inflation is a bit of a concern. It is likely to become more of a concern if Omicron leads to supply side disruptions. And that is likely to make inflation a bigger concern. But, the financial markets are already seeing some degree of volatility, increased volatility on the back of raging Omicron, waves across many of the developed markets. We are likely to see, and given that the other countries, particularly the US, has responded to it in a certain way, their fear of inflation will mean that the Fed will move in. If you're going to see a hike in the interest rate in developed markets like the US, naturally it is going to induce high degree of volatility in the Indian markets as well. So of course, in a highly integrated economy and financial economy, volatility in one part of the globe will naturally get reflected in others. So for us, that is a concern, and it is a growing concern. One thing, as I'm analyzing the latest periodic labor force survey data, is that, it is remarkable the kind of growth trajectory, particularly in terms of jobs, that India was in the year 2019-20. You can see that for every state, you can see that for rural, urban, you can see that for different categories of employment, casual, self-employed, regular, etc. That the kind of rising jobs, employment across sectors, and then suddenly the real cost that COVID has imposed on India's real economy, not just financial GDP, except real economy, in terms of jobs and labor market, has been very severe. And it has been most severely felt, of course, by casual workers. But for casual workers, it mostly is a 0-1 kind of a decision. They are losing jobs. So unemployment has risen a lot for casual workers. But for the self-employed, the earnings are the biggest, the biggest decline in earnings have happened amongst the self-employed people. That they are not necessarily losing jobs. So, it is not getting reflected in unemployment numbers, but there has been severe decline in earnings for self-employed people. And a very large number of our labor force is self-employed. For the regular salaried group labor markets, it has been a relatively better time. Of course, public sector is almost unaffected. And therein lie the great inequities in India's labor market, why people like government jobs, that even in the backdrop of such a devastating and catastrophic impact, we are seeing that the public sector is relatively unscathed, while the private sector has seen a big decline, almost 30% in the beginning, 2 quarters, etc. But now it's catching up. Regular, in fact, a large segment have also gained, IT, etc., pharma. Many sectors have gained in terms of earnings. So the impact to the real economy, Omicron is going to induce new volatility. And we have to be prepared for that. But I'll tell you, beyond looking at economy the way traditionally economists, we look at 4 or 5 macro indicators. We are hoping that in the new budget, our fiscal deficit targets will be conservative. We will be able to, keep it, because unlike many OECD countries, huge stimulus was not announced, because most likely the understanding, in which was, in hindsight, absolutely the right way to think. And I had written about this several times as well, that in countries like ours, more cash in the hands of people will, against this kind of uncertainty, is only going to lead to rising what is called precautionary savings. People will keep the money because you are saving for a rainy day. And in fact, we have seen that in many of the richer countries, the stimulus has led to huge inflation. So there are new problems there. We don't have that problem right now because we didn't have the kind of stimulus. For us, the government support happened more in the form of trying to avoid humanitarian crisis. So the bottom 40% saw a lot of direct cash and grains, food grain distribution, etc. Support were given from credit markets. So to the MSMEs, the guarantees, etc. were extended. And then, of course, large infrastructure projects announced, in the last budget, so on and so forth. But beyond some of these core, just macro indicators, economy is not 5 or 6 macro indicators. Economy, real economy, and something that I'm very passionate about, has to do with, of course, jobs, but the education sector, beyond the health sector. Now, I'll be preaching to the choir in this group if I talk about health sector. So we know that, against being pushed against the wall, the government is spending. Most state governments are also spending in healthcare. That is the need, so on and so forth. But look at the massive disruption we are seeing in schooling. So while higher education has adapted, because higher education is also a relatively smaller sector, school education in India has seen one of the largest disruptions globally in any country. We are currently comparable to several African countries. And yet we are digitally very well connected. But this transition, digital classrooms cannot replace in many parts of our country, including, I would dare say, in cities like Delhi, Mumbai, etc. We have a very large segment of the population which is not digitally connected, or they do not. If they are connected, it is not enough to carry out schooling. Now, this is where I think the scientific community and I think research and data would be the right way to move. That if what Dr. Jacob John has said, that with the 3rd year of the pandemic, if children, beyond the vaccination question, are relatively safer, why is it that is one segment, that is one part of the economy which we have shut away, and we are refusing to form policies on this? Delhi schools, of course, not just the pandemic, but Delhi schools were shut again because of the pollution, etc. The surveys which are now being done in the schooling sector is telling us that we are already seeing a very big loss in learning of children below in the 6th, 7th, 8th. Now they have done it for these, they have also done it for primary, but the biggest decline they are seeing, in fact, loss of learning, which is measured as reading capabilities, writing capabilities, different cognitive skills, etc. Imagine the long-term impact, the cost in human capital. So I think, the pandemic has taken, even in terms of financial, the way we are measuring the cost to GDP is a very limited way of looking at the true economic cost, what this pandemic has imposed on a country like ours. The real costs far outweigh. And I think that is where we owe it. The research community owes it to the larger public to come out with these estimates. We should now be looking at what are the true costs. And in the health sector, we have to look beyond COVID. And you're all absolutely well versed with this, that what is the disruption that COVID has done to the health sector itself? That how many procedures are getting delayed on the back foot, or, doctors unwilling to look at patients too scared to go out, so on and so forth. But at the end, I will just say one thing. And this is based on a comment that earlier one of our fellow panelists made, that you can't trust the data. But if we can't trust the data, what else do we go by? In fact, we are working with such limited data in India that, and I know that putting out information on daily cases, etc., is pointless. Because we know that it's a measure of how much we are testing. We know that this is a highly transmissible, but beyond cases, the case numbers are passionate, they are extremely sensational. But we should right now be guided by what is the hospital bed occupancy in every city in the country. Now that is such a basic information that every urban local body, perhaps even beyond, local government should be able to put out for the community. We should be governed, given that the information coming out, the evidence coming out is that it's not the infection. Many people are getting well in homes. The symptoms are relatively milder. Of course, overall, if the base increases, you will flood the hospitals. But what is the situation with the hospitals? What is the occupancy? How many ICUs? How many ventilators, etc.? So that is the information which will eventually guide decision making at the local level, economic level. So a firm can therefore decide that, look, can I, there is high infection rate in my area, but the hospital beds are not, meaning it's not so severe. It's not. So perhaps I can get people to come and work for a few hours with social distancing, etc., etc. Right now, what is happening is that we are putting out so little data, and it is, I must say that it is a crying shame. I think it is a reflection of our low commitment, and it's about time that we show a heightened commitment to data. ICMR is sitting with data, not just on infection. Infection data has become public, but ICMR has data on people getting vaccinated. ICMR has data on a lot more variables, because Aadhaar is that fundamental tying sort of variable. It's all based on Aadhaar. It's really just a couple of days worth of analysis. Why are we not looking at reinfections, breakthrough infections? Why are we not looking at, what is the severity of this wave, etc.? It's about time. Third year into the pandemic. By now, we should have this kind of commitment and this capacity across so many of our public health institutions. And it's not just ICMR. I keep saying ICMR because they are the most visible part of it. Ministry of Health has several other institutions, the NHSRC, NCDC. We have many institutions which must take the onus of putting out this kind of a larger public good, because now, fear and uncertainty can cripple an economy. And I think now we are at a phase when no government, even local government, is not going to risk lockdowns. It's just unsustainable. So you're not going to see that. But it is getting reflected in individual decision making. Now, being responsible is one thing, but destruction of livelihood in a long sustained period like this is not going to be possible for local authorities to handle. And therefore, the only way, I believe, data is never perfect, but data is the best weapon we have. Data means information. If we can put out credible information in all honesty, transparently, I think it will go a long way towards building, trust, and more than trust, building a certain comfort level, and helping not just health decisions, but also fundamental economic decisions of Indians. So thank you. I'll stop with that. Happy to take it further.
Thank you, Shambhikaji. Shambhikaji's very opinion about the economic situation is, Shambhikaji is cautiously optimistic on the economy prediction, but Shambhikaji stressed a very important part. That is how our children's education is significantly affected. And number two, the inadequate data that we have today, even after 2 years of pandemic. These two aspects needs detailed discussion during our panel discussion. Next, Dr. Aqsa Sheikh will talk to us on, let us not forget about the poor and the vulnerable. We need to look how the poor and vulnerable have suffered during the pandemic. Dr. Aqsa?
Verma, I'm in the middle of the meeting I told you yesterday. Yeah, okay, right, yeah.
Yeah, thanks, Dr. Abdul Ghafoor, and it's really a pleasure to be back on this panel with all these people full of wisdom. And I must congratulate you on selecting a very pertinent subtopic in the terms of lives and livelihood, because we often talk in terms of COVID infections, deaths, fatality, but we do not look at the long-term impact that this pandemic has been having, especially since we are now in the third year of the pandemic. So I would first of all, like to contrast between what was our reaction to the pandemic in the start of 2020 when it first entered into India, and now in January 2022 when we are having one more wave of the pandemic. And I think there's a lot of lesson that we have learned in the last 2 years. So in March 2020, we started with a nationwide lockdown, which was announced in a jiffy, and the transport was closed. People were stranded. And we saw a lot of migrant workers walking bare feet, to their destination. We saw how the livelihoods completely collapsed, and many people dying not by COVID, but because of the lockdown and the effect which lockdown had. Fortunately, 2 years down the line, I think we have been wiser in responding to the pandemic, and we are seeing that there has been no mass lockdown announced in any part of the country, in spite of now we exceeding the number of cases that we saw in the second wave, for example, in Delhi. We are not seeing any major shutdown of transport or other services which connect people. So those are good things. But then again, as we talked about it in the start of the panel discussion, the evidence-based decision-making. We still are having night curfews. We still are having weekend curfews on Saturdays and Sundays. What is the logic? And there have been a lot of jokes and memes on this, that does COVID not transmit during the nighttime or on Saturdays and Sundays? The schools have been the first victim, of often the government response. Though 2 years down the line, we now know that children are not the most vulnerable group, and that especially with a lot of precautions and all, the schools can continue functioning. In fact, a lot of advisory has come in that schools should be the last places to actually, undergo lockdown. But now we are seeing that they are often the first ones to undergo lockdown. We're also seeing that, especially in the first phase, we saw that in Delhi, that the transport, local public transport was restricted. We said metros will have only 50% capacity, or buses will not have standing passengers and all that. And again, there is no logic for that. In fact, it only cripples the livelihoods of the blue collar workers in these cities, and especially the migrant workers. So it's really time now that, the administration and the healthcare workers come together, they share data and the evidence, and really make policies based on those evidence for taking decisions on lockdowns, partial restrictions, curfews, closure of the schools, or public transport services. Now, I would also like to bring over here that, especially since I come from Delhi, we are not dealing here with one disaster, but with two disasters. Since Diwali, we have been seeing that there has been a severe air pollution, crisis that the city is facing. In fact, even now, in spite of a lot of weather changes, the weather is absolutely dangerous to breathe in. The air is absolutely polluted. And we saw that the schools were closed because of air pollution. And then they were opened briefly for a couple of days, and then again they were closed. So, and we know that the indoor air pollution is probably more dangerous, than kids venturing out and breathing the air. So again, we need more evidence, and we need to question these kind of decisions as to why the schools are often, the first victim. And also an important point is that when it comes to the schools, it's not only about children. There are a lot of teachers and a non-teaching staff which is involved, and a lot of women have participatory role in these, whether it's the role of the caretakers, it's the role of the bus drivers, it's the role of the cleaners or the housekeeping staff. With online education, other than teachers, most of the staff which is associated with the schools have lost their jobs. So if you look at the school vans and buses and their drivers and conductors, those jobs are completely gone. If you look at the caretakers in the schools, the housekeeping staff, that's completely gone. And we do not see that coming back. And most of these are people from the unorganized sector. A lot of that were actually women who were taking part in this, and these jobs are completely gone. So, when you close down public transport, for example, in the cities, it's the women who suffer more than men, who often use two-wheelers or more forms of private transport to get to the jobs. And they are the ones who completely lose their jobs and wages. Another important thing which I have been pondering upon since the government came out with the only essential services will go on and non-essential services will not go on is, how do you decide this bifurcation of essential and non-essential services? Is it essential for the society, or is it essential for the individual? If we say that if these are the services which are essential for the individuals, then your classification of essential and non-essential services changes completely. So, when it comes to the marginalized sections, we often ask this question: is sex work, for example, an essential service? Is begging an essential service? Now, if you ask a sex worker or a beggar, it is whether it is an essential service for them or not. I mean, their livelihood depends on it. But for the government, these are invisible services. These are non-essential services. If you look at the service, for example, of a bus driver or bus conductor of a school, with the schools gone, these are all non-essential services. The bars, for example, have been closed. I'm a teetotaler and I often, talk about people getting de-addicted. But let's talk about a bartender. Is the service of a bartender an essential service? So when we are talking about livelihoods, we have to keep our biases, personal biases behind and really ask this question, for how long can really the system continue with all these closures and lockdowns, and how we have evolved. So we have now turned on to the Zoom meeting, but can every work be done on Zoom? So in Delhi, they have said that all private offices will now do work from home. But can all private work be done, from home is the question that we need to ask. So I'll not go in a long lecture since Shamika has already covered most of the points. So over to you, Dr. Abdul.
Thank you, Dr. Aksa. Again, Dr. Aksa also stressed the same point. The white collar workers may not be affected, but ordinary people, real ordinary people are seriously affected by the pandemic. And again, many of our decisions are not really evidence-based. What we need is evidence for our decisions. And after 2 years of the pandemic, we haven't generated that evidence for many of our decisions. Next, Dr. Rajiv Jaydevan will explain to us on is boost vaccines the right strategy for our country or for any country. Rajiv.
Thank you. We are waiting, let's say in an airport lounge, you're flying from, say, Chennai to Delhi. Now, there are two options. You can buy the Boeing 737 or A320. I would pick either. Would any of you differ? I don't think so. I don't honestly care what aircraft I'm getting into, as long as it gets me there. Now, suppose a person sitting next to me is a tech-savvy person, browses the internet and tells me, look, the Boeing 737 gets into an accident, 1 in 16 million flying hours. And in comparison, the A320, which is the Airbus, gets it 1 in 14 million hours. He'll say, look, I'm not flying the Airbus because the Boeing 737 is safer. So what will you do? As it plays on our mind, eventually, if we hear a couple of other people also say, look, I don't think the Airbus is very safe. I think we should really stick to the 737. When talk goes around and a lot of people start sending WhatsApp messages and tweets, soon a rational person like me, who would otherwise not bother to choose between aircraft, I'll start reading the literature. And then the more I read, the more I'll confirm that, well, what they're saying is true. I should never fly that aircraft again. I should only stick to 737. Now, this is the problem with data. We talked about quality data. I'm going to share some slides. The question, as always with data, is it relevant? Have any practical meaning with all these fancy graphs that people throw at us? Boosters, where are we going is what I title my very brief talk on. In English, there's a saying, if you don't know where you're going, it's unlikely that you'll reach there. Now, this was first said to me by Professor M.V. Pillai. Let me draw the immunology of vaccination, because I know that this talk will be seen by many people who are not well versed with immunology eventually. So here are 3 situations, 1, 2, and 3. This is immediately after your second dose, 6 months after the second dose of vaccine. And in comparison, I have used what is called a vaccinated person as well. So let's go through the first case. Someone who's just received, most healthcare workers, I think, got their second dose sometime in February or March last year. So you have two walls. Basically, the vaccine has created two walls, and the virus has to get past both walls. And this wall is standing tall. It's made of neutralizing antibodies, which I think a school kid understands what a neutralizing antibody is nowadays. There's so much talk about. The world is obsessed with neutralizing antibodies for many reasons. It's easier to measure. That doesn't make it the best parameter, but unfortunately, something that's easier to measure gets all the publicity. So the first wall is of neutralizing antibodies, and the second is made of T cells, which basically protects our internal organs. After 6 months, the first wall shrinks in height, makes it easier for the virus to jump over. And as the virus runs towards the second wall, the virus finds the second wall is still unchanged and perhaps a little bit better, maybe, because it's going to shoot more precise antibodies after affinity maturation. Now, the second wall is actually made of a bunch of cells, which includes your memory cells, memory B cells, T cells, and so on. So that's the second wall. Now, for comparison, the unvaccinated and uninfected person, there's no first wall. The virus just walks over it. And by the time this is time, by the time the virus reaches the second wall, the body realizes there's something going on, and the body quickly tries to put a wall together. So the body is piling some walls together, piling some stones together, and building a wall. Some people can do it, others cannot. They just fail. They just give up. The older you are, the less likely you'll be able to make a second wall at short notice, and that is the purpose of vaccination. When you vaccinate someone, you are custom building it's like a prefabricated wall. They put it in place. So if this person is unfortunate enough to get an infection, the wall is already in place for you. So that is fundamentally what vaccine is doing for us. How long do these second doses last? We talked about waning of antibodies, waning of neutralizing antibodies, vaccines losing their effect. Remember, vaccines work on two fronts. A, they may stop you from picking up an infection, particularly in the first couple of months. And every passing month after that, their ability to stop infection declines to such an extent that after 6 months, that ability may trend towards zero, may trend, depending on what study you read. The Qatar study shows that it is well below zero after that. You can't go below zero there. Let's see. What is the data? We talked about good quality data. I'll give you the best quality data that I could get hold of while answering this question. Are boosters necessary or not? Are 2 doses enough? Clearly, anyone who took 2 doses are getting infected all around the world. We know that. So their protection against infection drops. But their protection against severe disease, if you see this graph here, let me explain it to our viewers. Over here are the age groups, and here are the critical care admissions in England, Wales, and Northern Ireland. So the ICNARC data, which is highly acclaimed, and they are precise in their data collection and reporting. This is data from May through 15th of December. If you look over here, let me clear the graph. Over here, you can see the first dose, the second dose, and the third dose all clumped together as a single line. You can't tell them apart. Over here, they're all the same. Whereas over here, you have a big spike of unvaccinated people, and the worst is in the 60 to 69 segment. The widest gap between vaccinated and unvaccinated is in the 60th to 69th segment. These are people who were admitted to critical care, and that's important. Critical care admission is different from hospitalization. If you walk into an ER and say you have a temperature, it's counted as a hospitalization in many countries. So there we are. So this is data from England, Wales, and Northern Ireland. No difference whether you take 2 doses or 3. Now, 1 dose group is tiny here, so let's just assume 1 dose. We'll just leave that aside. This is again data from ICNARC. This is from their report of 7th January, that is from this past week. Again, on the x-axis, you see different age groups, 70 plus, 60 to 69, 50 to 59 here. On the y-axis is the chance of getting to ICU, getting admitted. Again, this is really what we want, right? The vaccines. Ultimately, we want not to die. Whether we get infected or not, we do not want to die. None of us want to die. So that's really why we take vaccines. Now let's look at what happens if you vaccinate. If you're unvaccinated, let's look at the 50 to 59 segment here. You got a 3.1% chance of being admitted to the ICU over a 5-year estimated risk, assuming that the risk that occurred between May through December is calculated and an average is taken. If you take the 60 to 69 segment and you're unvaccinated, your risk of getting admitted to the ICU is 10%. That is not trivial. 1 in 10. If you vaccinate this person, just see where the numbers come to. Over here. Can you see? Can anyone see that? You got to squint, like the author said. You got to really squint to see this data. See that? 0.2%. It is on the 0 line here. And here is a 50 to 50. There's a 2-dose group. There's a 3-dose group. Here's a 2-dose group and a 3-dose group. See, you got to really use a microscope to see if there's even a ripple on the 0 line here. All right. So, in other words, this graph basically tells us that if you vaccinate, whether it is 2 or 3, you're well protected from being admitted to the ICU, or in other words, from being critically ill. Let's fly across the Atlantic on our A320. I'm willing to fly the plane that's less, let's say, safe, according to my neighbor. So I've flown across to the Atlantic, taken a look at CDC's data. Now, this is data as of today. If you look at their graph today, I'll explain the x-axis again. This is about approximately 6-week period, approximately. And on the y-axis is the incidence of death, number of deaths per 100,000 population. Can you see here? There's a 2-dose group and here's a 3-dose group. You can't tell them apart. You can't. And here are the unvaccinated group. Remember, the unvaccinated group also have a little bit of what is called natural infection. So they are not like your unvaccinated controls in 2020 August when the trial started. This is 2022 December or January. Many of these people have natural immunity. Now, we're comparing vaccine immunity and natural immunity at this point. See the big difference? So they conclude that if you are vaccinated, you're about 20 times less likely to die from COVID-19. It really does not matter whether you take 2 doses or 3 doses. Now, I can't sit here and say where these lines will go, say in 2023. I have no idea. I'll have to just wait and see how it behaves. I think our future policy on booster doses will be decided sometime in June. I'm just guessing here, 2022, when we have honest, unbiased, well-reported data comparing these 2 groups. Honesty, very important. And I'm not a fan of observational studies, because observational studies, you can tweak it in any direction we want. Unfortunately, the only randomized study on boosters was done by Pfizer company. They compared a huge number of people. They randomized them into 2 groups, 2 dose and 3 dose. You know the results? nobody in either group even got hospitalized, let alone die. So that is enough to rest my case here. This is again my own work. I used the same graph from the CDC to show you what it actually means. Let's take a look here. Unvaccinated, 2-dose and 3-dose, and on the y-axis is the death rate. The same graph, which I've basically drawn here, and these are the data I collected from the site. This I did yesterday. What I did was I took an average over each week so that there's no bias, because some days, some weeks 2 doses worse, other weeks 3 doses worse, and so on. So I took an average of around 6 weeks. So that's the average of 0.65. That is what I've shown here. And the other one, 0.75, is over here. Basically, this is 0. Right. So that's my point here. So I'll stop here. I'll let you think about it. And if you ask my opinion, I'll say this. With all the reading I've done from over the pandemic, 2 years, with multiple domains that cover the pandemic, including immunology, virology, genetics, pharmacology, economics, ethics, everything together, medical literature, I'll say this. If you were fortunate enough to live on the planet and get 2 doses of vaccine, you're good. If you belong to a special group, you may or may not benefit from a 3rd dose. If you are at very high risk of picking up an infection, if you can't tolerate an infection, taking a 3rd dose will give you a 10-week umbrella, which will shield you from infection and its natural outcomes. Now, the person has to decide whether to take it or not. And I'm talking about the science here, and this is my opinion. Policies are different. Governments take policies based on multiple parameters. And when policies are taken, it must be followed. That is generally how governments work, and that's how nations work. So what I've given here is a view of the science. And it is my opinion that we must walk away from the trap of more and more data that tells us to reduce our risk further and further. From where? From 0 to where? Where are we going to reduce that risk is my question to you. So I'll stop now.
Thank you, Rajiv, for a wonderful explanation on the basics of vaccine immunity and stressing the point. We don't have to vaccinate the whole, we don't have to give a booster dose to the whole population. Maybe we can give a booster to the high-risk group. That's what currently our country is doing. And now I understand why our government don't like the word term booster. Instead, a precautionary dose could be the ideal one. Thank you, Rajiv. Dr. Anand Bhan now will talk to us on vaccine equity. Is the world still selfish?
Thank you, Abdul. Pleasure to be on the panel, and already some great and very eloquently explained perspectives already shared. So if I was, if this was a debate motion, then I would be clearly for the motion. Is the world still selfish? And the reason is that if you look at updated analysis, on the global share of people who've been vaccinated against COVID-19, if you look at fully vaccinated, I think the data is somewhere around 50%. So around 50% of the global population has been fully vaccinated, and this is where I'm referring to 2 doses, as Rajiv very kindly explained that that's what we should be working with. Anything beyond that is a booster dose. If you look at partially vaccinated, globally around 9% population, but not vaccinated, not even with 1 dose or 2 doses, we are talking about 41% of the world's population. And that, of course, is a problem, right? And now if you look at the range, let's look at maybe some outliers on both sides. So you have, say, UAE on one side, which is around 92% fully vaccinated. I'm not going into which vaccine or what combination. And then you have countries like Ethiopia, on the other hand, 1% fully vaccinated. So that's the range we are dealing with in the world, 1% to 92%. There might be some countries which are higher or lower. In a sense, only 5% of people living in low-income countries are fully vaccinated. And that, of course, is is something to worry about, because if you're talking about a world which is interconnected, we're talking about a pandemic which easily travels across borders, whatever kind of restrictions you build in, then it is not just an equity issue, it is a justice issue. And the reason to worry about that is because the impact or toll this will have certainly is higher in the segment of the population which is more vulnerable, which is more poor. And I think Aksa also spoke to this issue, that the impact of any kind of a disease, and especially a disease which also has so many associated steps taken from a policy perspective, tends to be always highest on those who are marginalized or those who are disempowered, right? So the fact that now, after well into 2 years of the pandemic, if we don't have a global understanding that unless everyone is protected, none of us are protected, then it is a problem. And hence the focus has to be to talking about how do we ensure that we get our vaccination rates across the board, all across the world, higher. The variants will continue to develop. I mean, Omicron is one second. Sorry, the pleasures of working from home. All right. So, as I was saying, that the focus has to be on getting these rates higher. The variants will continue to develop. Omicron has shown breakthrough capabilities, even though, as Rajiv said, perhaps it's not something to worry about as long as it doesn't put you into a hospital and doesn't kill you. But the case is that will future variants be different, and will they be more lethal? And are they likely to cause problems? And that situation will always be a possibility unless we get more and more people protected, and vaccination is the way to go for that. Now, this is not just an issue about rich countries or poor countries. There are many parts of rich countries, there are many parts of countries like ours where also that inequity exists, or that justice issue exists. If you look at our own population in India, this is an issue we need to also then talk about. Are there segments of the population which are usually not considered vulnerable? And a good example, I do a lot of work now in mental health, is people with serious mental illnesses. There is now enough data from multiple papers which shows that people with serious mental illnesses are at a much higher risk of getting serious implications of disease, but they've never been part of priority lists. They're not considered as a vulnerable population, and so they are never put upfront as a population we should focus on. And that is true even now for the booster doses. Serious mental illnesses, I don't think, are part of the paradigm. If you look at persons who have been historically marginalized, Aksa and I work on communities such as transgender communities, persons with disability. There are huge issues with being able to access vaccines. There are, of course, some positive examples as well, but there are a lot of barriers of being able to access vaccination. So, of course, we need to look at the larger picture, but we also need to look at issues which exist within our own countries and how we can focus on ensuring that those populations which are vulnerable globally, as well as in our own countries, are actually able to access vaccination, and we support them. So for me, I think the key issue is, can we get more and more of the world to get those 2 doses of vaccines, and how quickly we can do it? And for that, what do we need to do more of? I mean, the reason that we have vaccines and vaccines have come to us so fast is because there's been an inordinate amount of R&D which has happened in a relatively very, very short amount of time. A lot of that has been supported by a lot of public money. Both in India and many other countries, there's been a lot of support which has come from the government. And if that is true, that vaccine R&D has been enabled, then why is it that we are so much reliant on the charity of pharma companies to be able to get more people to get the vaccine? Isn't that a problem? That you are basically at the mercy of multinationals in making decisions around whether more people should be protected, and by protecting more people, protecting everyone else, including all of us. So I think the solutions will need to lie on really creative ways of approaching this, because this is not a new problem. This is not a problem which has not been raised before in the context of other diseases, and this really requires us to think out of the box. So what out of the box will certainly mean is looking at what needs to be done differently, looking at the TRIPS agreement, for example, looking at IP agreements, for example, looking at tech transfer, production know-how transfer, supporting facilities in LMICs, working with manufacturers who have the capacity to produce vaccines at pace, and then figuring out how we can get more vaccines across to those who have not yet received the vaccines. And if the numbers continue to look dismal in the way they look right now across countries, then I'm afraid we might be having another follow-up of these discussions, maybe 6 months down the line, maybe 12 months down the line, perhaps with a new variant in the mix, and still struggling to answer when will this pandemic end. And I think that is something which we should all worry about. So at the end of the day, this is certainly a world which still is fairly selfish. Unfortunately, equity and justice is not something that we are seeing globally. And if we really want to look at the end point for this pandemic, then part of that certainly in a major way has to be for us to focus on this issue of how do we get more and more of our world and citizens across various countries, not just in our own countries, vaccinated against COVID-19. I'll stop here, Abdul, in the interest of time.
Thank you, Anand, for stressing the point. Yes, the world is interconnected, but still the world is selfish. And that reminds me, yes, if you look from a satellite, London, New York, and Sierra Leone, we can see all these places. But the vaccination status in all these places are entirely in different perspectives. If you look from Mukesh Ambani's $1 billion home, Andalia in Mumbai, you look from the top floor, you can see the slum in Mumbai. But in India, the vaccine Mukesh Ambani receives is exactly the same as those received in Mumbai slum. Thank God we have got a powerful pharmaceutical industry and everybody is getting vaccine free of cost. But that is not the scenario across the world. Still, there is no vaccine equity in the world. And that's something, a very, very bad, sad and bad scenario. Let's proceed to the panel discussion. First, let's go back to the topic Dr. Jacob John discussed. Should we COVID vaccinate our children? And Dr. John believes, yes, children should be vaccinated. We should be careful, wise, and we need very safe vaccine. Anand, what do you think about Dr. Jacob John's statement?
I tend to agree that where we have data which supports that vaccines are safe for children and they are going to help protect more of the population, we should certainly do it. And we are starting to see that happen in many countries, including our own. But we also have to acknowledge that kids are much lesser at risk. I mean, it might be perhaps different across variants, etc. But given that kids are so mobile and especially in context where there is a possibility they might get mild infection or asymptomatic infection and they bring back infection, and that puts family members or contacts at risk. So, in terms of being perhaps carriers of infection, which could have much serious implications, certainly a cause for worry. So if there is data to support that vaccines are safe and efficacious for a pediatric age population, certainly we should do it. And yeah, I mean, I guess we're starting to see more of that happen across the world, and hopefully more of that will continue to happen.
Aksa, what do you think about pediatric vaccination? Should we spend all our resources on pediatric vaccination, COVID vaccination?
Yeah, so as Anant also mentioned that there's a lot of inequity when it comes to vaccination, which has been done. Overall, the numbers look very pretty that, for example, in cities like Delhi and Mumbai, almost everyone has got one dose. When you look at pockets of vulnerable populations, if you look at migrant workers, if you look at, for example, the trans community, disabled community, there are pockets of people who are unvaccinated. So I think the door-to-door vaccination campaign, which the government has launched currently, that needs a lot of focus to reach the vulnerable population before we start doing a lot of, the third booster or the fourth round of vaccination or vaccination for children who are not really that at risk currently in the pandemic. So it's more important to focus on those who are more vulnerable and are not able to access the vaccination because we have limited resources. And if you look at the ground reality, the vaccine trust, especially after Omicron, has been eroding. A lot of people are now questioning But what's the use of getting 2 doses or even 3 doses of vaccination if people are still getting infection? So we also need focused communication in order to establish the vaccine confidence amongst people, amongst even the healthcare workers for that matter. So we need to, I think, focus on that too.
Thank you. Rajiv?
Yes. If you ask me, this is my opinion. Vaccination must have an aim for COVID-19. And given the limitations of the vaccines in circulation today, there is a severe limitation of inability to stop infection. They are not good at stopping infection. They're not. We need to accept that. I know there are plenty of egos around, people who glorify vaccines, but I don't glorify any medication for that matter. I see medications with a completely impartial view. So vaccine, as far as I'm concerned, is just like I'm a gastroenterologist. Any medicine that I use, I'm not in love with any medicine. That's my point. They're good at some things. That is, as I mentioned, they're good at stopping severe disease. Now, children are extremely unlikely to get severe disease. I'll give you data from Kerala. 1 out of 70,000 children who had COVID infection had a death. I know each death is painful. And among these people who unfortunately passed away, many of them had severe neurological disability. Children with cancer survived, children with diabetes survived, children who were obese survived. Now, that's the first wave. The second point I have is the children, at least the surveys that we've done, particularly in places like Delhi, we've already had about 90 plus seroprevalence. So what are we trying to vaccinate them for? I would imagine if you want to create an immunological memory, the child already has been exposed to the virus. After we are through with Delta, I think every child in India, with a few exceptions, might be naturally vaccinated against COVID-19. Now, if a child has an immune memory, why would you want to push a vaccine into a child? And the third is the opaqueness about safety about vaccines in some parts of the world. I'm concerned, as was earlier pointed out, the question about feasibility of vaccine must be weighed against what we are trying to achieve. If you're trying to protect a child who's already naturally protected from an excellent innate immunity from this virus, whose death rate is 1 in 70,000, what is the safety of the vaccine we are trying to use? We know that vaccines rarely have caused severe complications. We've had published series about Guillain-Barré syndrome. People have gone on ventilators. People have had neuropathies, transverse myelitis, and deaths. Rarely. I know these are rare, but if you talk to the person who passed away, it is not rare for them. So we must not trivialize these negative outcomes. I know people are reluctant to talk about negative outcomes about vaccines because they think that if you talk about these negative outcomes, you promote vaccine hesitancy. Let me talk to you a little bit about penicillin. Penicillin kills people, yes. A small number of people who take penicillin just die on the spot. We are aware of that. Diclofenac injections kill people. I've seen it happen to people who are known to me. It happens. They just die on the spot. It may be 1 in, I don't know, maybe several thousands, but for that person, it's a tragedy that you can't even imagine. So we must never take the safety of vaccines for granted, particularly when data is not transparent or publicly available. So these are my concerns. If you ask me, I would say a child who is not naturally infected, who is particularly vulnerable for a bad outcome, I would single out to vaccinate. The rest, if you ask me, I would leave them alone. And my pediatrician friends who are networked with extensively have overwhelmingly agreed with this view, that they believe in their practice that we are not seeing severe illness in children yet, and long COVID in India is so rare. And I can second that because I've trained around 6,000 school principals in Kerala in person. And everyone I asked them, are you seeing children who are having problems? You know what? If I talk to a group of 150 school principals, one of them may say, you know what, one child reported feeling a little tired a couple of weeks later. That's it. This is raw data. This is on the ground information I'm giving you. So these studies that exaggerate about long COVID and doctors who write about it because, you know, many doctors have a favorite theme, that does not mean that every child must be vaccinated. So this is my view. And I had said this before, I would add one more subset to that. If a child lives with a person who's at worse risk for a bad outcome, that child could be considered for a vaccine as well, because the child could carry the infection home. But we know that these vaccines are not good at stopping infection. Tops 3 months, you're going to get reinfected again, particularly in a school. That's my view.
Thanks, Rajiv. So you believe we don't have to vaccinate all children. We can consider vaccinating children with high risk, like cancer patients, or those with a relative with other high risk conditions. Like
I would add cerebral palsy, and I'm talking about severe neurological disabilities. Dr. Anandban rightly mentioned about people with mental illness. They are marginalized because people look down upon them, and you know they have every right to live on the planet as anyone else does. And I think I'm glad Dr. Anandban mentioned that as well, that group, yeah. And Dr. Sheikh as well. Yeah.
Shambhika, do you think we have to spend all our resources on pediatric vaccination? We have got a lot of other vaccines to introduce and other public health issues.
Well, that is truly a very difficult question, Dr. Kapoor. Frankly, as economists, I think the main contribution we make to any decision making is to estimate the trade-offs. When you have 1 rupee to spend, you often have to worry about the opportunity cost of it, meaning what else can you spend it? And I think there I wholeheartedly agree. And I echo the skepticism that Dr. Jayadevan has put it out there, that we are seeing almost a crescendo. There is, while it is noisy, the space of research and, currently vis-a-vis COVID, it is unfortunately also not open and transparent, where we can have this kind of skepticism wade into major decision making. We are going by simple thumb rules, back of the envelope kind of calculations. Unfortunately, again, the kind of nuance that Dr. Jayadevan, Dr. Bhan, Dr. John, what he mentioned, or Dr. Sheikh, if we could put some resources into identifying the high vulnerable, instead of going by simple thumb rules like, let's just vaccinate everyone, because, it is overwhelmingly good. But what are those tail end events? And how significant are they in the Indian case? Again, I think we don't know. Even yesterday, and I feel a bit sad that yesterday, one of the press conferences by the Health Ministry and ICMR, they presented New York City data. It's third year into the pandemic. We need this kind of detailing. The seroprevalence survey, if it was held, Dr. Jayadevan is right. If you have 1 rupee worth to spend, even if it is on vaccination, let's assume we are not going to say whether we should spend it on, food, or we should spend it on defense or whatever. Even if we have to spend it on vaccine, the seroprevalence survey should be a guiding factor. That perhaps areas where, there is lower prevalence and they have not, developed any kind of natural immunity, perhaps we should target there. But you see that second order, or the nuance, is not creeping into policy making, because we are so overwhelmingly getting guided by simple rules. Simple rules are easy to communicate, but they're costly. And I think that is where we do pay a price. We might end up vaccinating a large population, which perhaps we don't need to. Yeah.
Thanks, Shambhika. Again, Shambhika just stressed one important point, the importance of data. And we are not getting enough data out of our, very good institution. Our ICMR is very good. NCDs is very good. We all know that. But all this institution can give us more data, and probably all of us have to raise our hands and voice and convince the government we need more data. And because we have got the manpower, we have got the efficiency, and we can do it. if you want to do it. Coming to the topic, Shamigaji discussed about the economic part. One important part about children's education. I'm really surprised by Shamigaji's statement. During the transition period, we children suffered a lot, and in some places it's comparable to that of the level in Africa. And that's a real eye-opener. And Anand, what do you think about that? How much our children have suffered, our education have suffered?
Yeah, so whenever we we speak about children, there's two aspects to it. One, of course, is the impact on their education, and we know that as Dr. Shamika also very rightly pointed out, that impact has hit families with poorer access to resources much more than middle class families or upper class families. I mean, imagine if a family with 2 or 3 kids but only access to one device, and perhaps not able to recharge their prepaid connection. Even if you have access to a data recharge, you can perhaps maximize it and use it for one child, right? What happens to the other kids? So when everything transitioned to online, what does this really mean for a lot of children? And what kind of support was offered? And usually nothing. And that has meant that a lot of children have probably lost out or are much behind their ability to be at the same level as many of their peers who are perhaps from more well-to-do backgrounds. And that is a policy failure. That is also a societal failure, because if we are not able to invest in all of our children who are basically our future, then that is a problem. And this is not something which could not have been forecast. I mean, beyond the first 3 or 4 weeks of the pandemic, once it started to be clear that this was going to be a longer term test match rather than a T20 match, this is something that should have been planned for. But unfortunately, we still see those repercussions. Beyond that, not just about education, but also development, development of personality, the ability to connect with children your own age, going and being able to play in open environments, access to playgrounds, which is usually not there. Perhaps in school environments, at least there is an option to be able to spend time with your friends, but also go and access a small playground at the school level, even in rural areas. All of those opportunities were not there for extended periods of time. And I think India is among the few countries, quite honestly, where we've had such an extended period where there has been a lack of schooling, physical schooling. Most other countries, even during waves, have continued often with school. And this is something for us to think about, that, while we do prioritize children's well-being, and for good reason, if the data clearly shows that the impact is very, very lesser for kids, and there are ways of trying to reduce it further by enhancing mask usage, public health measures, by getting their teachers vaccinated, transport staff vaccinated, encouraging people at home to get vaccinated and take precautions, then why is it that we have not really looked at schooling being one of the priority areas where we should have restarted schools as soon as possible? And now what we are seeing actually on the converse is that even with the variant, which is seemingly much less dangerous in terms of lethality or hospital admissions, we are seeing again more and more school going back to online schooling, right? So I don't know how long this will continue now further on for, but this certainly is unfortunately having a lot of negative repercussions on a lot of children, and this is something we should all worry about.
Aksa, what do you think about the schooling issue?
I think Anand has, talked about in detail of not just the scholastic, but the other, developmental impact that closure of the school has. And I mean, it's really one of the funniest decisions, I think, which has been made in the pandemic to close the schools. It's really surprising that, the school staff is doing a lot of other activities, including vaccination. So the school teachers are involved in vaccination. They're involved in doing RT-PCR testing also. They're involved in election duty in a lot of states where elections are happening, but they're not doing the job for which they have been appointed. So it's really time that, we create a noise and we demand that the schools be opened. I mean, it's been enough of stupidity. That's the only word that I can say. And apart from all this, we need to understand that we have been only talking about urban children. what happens to rural children, what happens to Adivasi children? No one even understands that they don't even have devices. They've never used devices in their life. The teachers have not used devices, forget about the students. So there is no possibility that they can carry out this kind of education. And also schools, they serve as a very important place where nutrition services are delivered to children, where immunization services are delivered to children. So we are seeing that, the midday meal program is not working properly in a lot of places. Take-home rations are not happening. We are seeing that the social skills, the numeracy skills, literacy skills have really gone down of the children. We have seen a lot of problems in communication, especially in children who have never been to school. So young children who are from playgroup, nursery age, they've never known what a school feels like, what a playground feels like. So these are the things happening. Then this is pushing children into child labor. Since a lot of parents can't afford online education, they are just the school dropouts happening. Young girls are getting married. We are talking of increasing the age to 21, but let's face the reality. There are many girls getting married at 15 and 16 simply because the schools have been closed. So these are a lot of social problems, that we have seen in the last 2 years. I think we should be wiser in the hindsight, and at least 2022 should be the year of school opening.
So it's very easy for the rich and the policymakers say, let's close the schools because there's a new wave coming. But the impact of that school closure is huge. Dr. Jacob John, what's your opinion about the boosters? Everybody is asking for boosters. So your mic is off.
All right.
Yes, sir.
Okay. Pediatricians are used to vaccinating children. There are so many vaccines. And the process of immunization using a vaccine that is a non-replicating vaccine, non-live attenuated vaccine, the process of vaccination is divided into priming and boosting. The priming is for hepatitis A or human papillomavirus, single dose priming, and a single dose boosting at the end of 6 months. That is investigated and proven to be effective. Whereas if you are going for DTP, HAB, hepatitis B, etc., you can use a 2-dose priming if you separate the 2 doses into 2 months, then 1 priming at the end of 1 year, or 3 doses at monthly interval, and then boosting about a year later. If you leave with priming and no boosting, that immunity will definitely wane. There is no question about that. And although coronavirus does not fit into our classical virological agents, and there are a lot of differences that we see that need to be explained. However, the boosting is a necessity based on the priming boosting principle. So that is from a technical or from a theoretical point of view. And the world over, first of all, vaccination is not just to prevent death. There is a mistaken notion that vaccination is against killer diseases or diseases to prevent death. So the vaccine efficacy is to be measured as how many died and how many did not die with vaccine. That's not the reality. Vaccination is to make life more comfortable, without morbidity, without hospitalization. So from that angle, the world over, unboosted people are getting hospitalized, many countries. So they say that this is an outbreak in the unboosted vaccination, unboosted people. This is an epidemic among unboosted people. So there, again, we need good, reliable, well-analyzed information based on which we can make decisions. So in the absence of that, I fall back upon the theory of priming and boosting. So until proven otherwise, I will definitely go for booster. And maybe one day it will be proved that it was not necessary, but we will worry about that. Okay, I will stop by that. So vaccination is not simply to prevent death. There are so many other things that we expect from vaccination.
Thank you, sir. Dr. Shamigaji, considering the huge amount of money that we spend on vaccination, our earlier vaccine budget, national vaccine budget was around 8,000 crore. And now COVID vaccine alone, we have spent several times more than our national vaccination budget. It's really worth going for booster for the whole population.
I think, Dr. Gafoor, we have to be led by the science here. Frankly, we don't have the luxury of rich countries to continue booster after booster. I'm being, utterly honest here. The data that Dr. Jayadevan showed, I've seen some for other countries as well. The marginal difference between the efficacy of 2 doses and 3 doses, I mean, we have to see how significant are these. Again, it's a cost-benefit analysis. So if it is a case of, if we have to give boosters, then we have to identify the extremely vulnerable rather than making it a widespread universal affair. And I think, frankly, that is the direction we are heading towards. Because we cannot afford, again, the reality of a resource poor country is something often people, experts, when they talk about India, emotionally meant, they're comparing our policies and outcomes to countries of the OECD, the very rich countries, and yet our per capita income is so low, and that we cannot possibly afford to spend money on seemingly marginal gains, unless it is to very specific group of vulnerable people, perhaps the older people with certain ailments, comorbidities, etc. It cannot become a universal affair like it is, for instance, in some other rich countries.
Thank you. We have a question from Dr. Mahesh Kant. Europe has declared today to do away with restrictions and consider this wave as flu and live with it. Israel is also considering to remove restrictions and move towards herd immunity as the hospitalizations are few. Any views? I don't know how correct the statement is. To my understanding, Israel is thinking about giving a 4th booster dose, but maybe they're considering opening up the restrictions. Any opinion from the panelists? What Europe is doing and what Israel is doing?
I think, there have been experiments in the past with reference to developing herd immunity. And we have seen the countries who took those decisions, taking those decisions back. So, when you are dealing with a virus which is very unpredictable, currently we have the Omicron variant, which apparently is less severe as compared to what we saw previously, but then there's no guarantee which new variant will come up, which new variant will develop. So going for a herd immunity approach, I don't think that is something which countries like India can afford.
But those European countries already have given 2 doses and even 3 doses of vaccine. Wouldn't it be possible for them to open up the economy completely without restrictions? Or some level of restrictions? Yes, sir.
May I say something? Hello?
Yes, sir.
Yes, okay. I described Omicron as a new pandemic. It's not a glib statement. I'm saying that the response to Omicron has been rather deja vu of response to Delta, which I think was we did not know enough, an error in judgment. So I call even the Omicron disease as COVID 2021, not COVID 2019. So it is more like a flu, and the overreaction is not, I don't think, justified or necessary. So yeah, life should go on with all the vulnerables protected with as much vaccination as necessary, including boosters. So yeah, I go by opening up. And in fact, the whole population in India are ignoring most of the precautionary measures, and they're living, they don't even wear masks. So I'm sympathetic to that approach.
Yeah. So I want to consider Omicron as a new pandemic and not just a continuation of the, in several aspects.
Yeah.
Rajiv?
Yes, Dr. Gafur.
What about opening up the economy? Now, majority of the countries had a single or 2 doses of vaccine. Do we need all these restrictions of traveling, public transport, 50% attendance? Is it all necessary now?
Yeah, it's a tough call about public transport because public transport in India tends to be in open vehicles, which if the vehicle is traveling at any speed, you're going to be at lower risk for transmission than if the same number of people are sitting in an air-conditioned bus. So that's one factor we might want to consider. And I personally don't think that if you leave one seat empty next to you, you're going to be less likely to be infected. Imagine if a man who smoked a cigarette just walked into your office, you're going to smell him from, typically it's a him in India, you're going to smell him from a distance. He doesn't have to, walk up right next to you. The same thing happens with COVID-19. It's primarily an indoor disease. And whenever people gather indoors and talk, I had written an article as early as April 10th, 2020, describing how exactly this virus spreads. Back then, people were talking about coughing and sneezing, and we kept getting these phone calls as well about coughing and sneezing. It's in fact an aerosol generated when we talk, primarily. And that's why people who go for parties after their boosters, 66% of them got infected after Pfizer boosters with Omicron. So we need to take in these facts without any prejudice, without any passion, which is why I said, don't fall in love with vaccines or any products. Just think about it as mere products, and discuss them purely based on merit. So the point back to your question is, should we open up the economy? I think so, because we've already had one round of natural immunity, at least one round of vaccine that covers a lot of people, and we've covered the vulnerable. In our country, we've rightly prioritized the people who are more likely to die. As you know, a 70-year-old who's unvaccinated is a lot more likely to die than a 20-year-old who's unvaccinated, perhaps of the order of 1,000 times, somewhere between 150 to 1,000 times likely to die. So we've protected that segment. And I think that during times of a surge, we have to have clever restrictions that will not suffocate people from the economy standpoint, but let the hospital systems run smoothly, particularly for non-COVID patients. Remember, if you have a heart attack, you go to a hospital, and if they say there are no beds, you don't have a lot of time to drive around for another hospital because you may die on the way. So these are real problems. So we have to, on the one hand, open the economy, and on the other hand, we need to keep a watch on the surge status. I'll call it red, orange, and yellow alert. And if the nation is in red alert or the region is in red alert, there are some activities that can be permitted and others that are not. That's the way I see it.
That is a very interesting question from an anonymous attendee. I have heard the other day, epidemiologist Dr. Jayaprakash Mulil saying Omicron is like a flu, and the very next day, sender countering it. This is creating some confusion. May I answer that question? Dr. Mulil mentioned—
I was going to ask you to answer that, Dr. Gafur. You're the best person who can answer that.
First of all, flu is not a simple disease. When Dr. Jayaprakash Mulil said Omicron is like flu, I don't think he meant neglect Omicron and carry on. He didn't say that. He told we have to treat Omicron like a flu. And if public believe flu is not it's a simple infection. Flu is not a simple infection. It kills the vulnerable. So when he mentioned compared Omicron with flu, he did not trivialize the Omicron. He did not trivialize the flu. Flu kills vulnerable. I treat cancer patients. I have seen several cancer patients dying due to flu. Flu kills the vulnerable. It's not a simple disease. So I agree with Dr. Mulil. Yes, Omicron can be compared with flu, but don't underestimate flu.
Dr. Gafur, I'll add one sentence to what you said. Flu killed my friend's husband, who was only 50. He was healthy. Don't take flu lightly. No, flu is not something that you take lightly. And it can cause very devastating symptoms to a lot of people. I think people may confuse flu with a common cold, like rhinovirus. No, flu is not rhinovirus. I'm so sorry. Flu, by the way, is a basket of viruses that belong to the influenza virus family. And every year, the basket changes. It's like getting a different fruit basket every year.
Yeah, I agree, Rajiv. The whole cause of confusion is public has confused flu, which is influenza virus, with that of common cold like a rhinovirus. These are entirely different entities. We need opinion from Dr. Jacob John on that.
Okay, the analogy with flu reinforces my idea that it is more like flu than like COVID-19. Flu and Omicron infections are essentially surface infections on the respiratory mucosa, essentially non-invasive, essentially not affecting deep organs by virus invasion and mucking up their functions. So yes, the incubation period, flu has 1 to 2 days, Omicron has 2 to 3 days, Delta has 4 to 7 or 10 days. So there are these differences between these two. That's why I'm not bringing the flu analogy here, although pathophysiologically, Omicron is closer to flu than to COVID-19, for which reason I said COVID-21, which is a different disease, different pandemic. So I think we responded to Omicron as if Delta came back in a new avatar. So there was this misunderstanding. I've been saying from the very, very beginning that it's a totally different infection and disease altogether. And flu is a good comparison, or good flu-like is very, very apt.
Yeah. Yes, sir. We have got a question from Mushtaq Beg. We have Delta and Omicron spreading simultaneously. Don't it make the pandemic or the situation more complicated and serious?
When 1957 H2N2 came, the 1918 H1N1 totally disappeared. You know why? Because H2N2 could spread faster and the cross immunity was sufficient to block H1N1. Then 1968, when H3N2 came, it spread even faster than H2N2, and the cross immunity was enough to displace H2N2. In 2009, when the pandemic came with H1N1, the new swine origin flu, it was not spreading faster than H3N2. Its cross immunity was not good enough to kill H3N2. So we have both simultaneously endemic and seasonal. So my guess is that both Omicron and Delta may be endemic together. And the one who gets Omicron first is lucky because he will protect against Delta. The one who gets Delta first will be unlucky because he would get COVID-19.
Yeah, thank you, sir. Now it's 8:45 already, it's 1 hour, 45 minutes. Very detailed discussion. Thank you all the panelists for a wonderful discussion, and everybody is asking for, we need data, and policy making should be evidence based, and we have the capability to produce evidence, and we need that evidence. Dr. Vijay?
Yeah, Dr. Abdul, as ever, you and your great panel has again given us one more enriched session. So I think this will help us open up more topics for discussion. Surely we'll come back to you again if we are going for a series 4 with you. Thank you very much. Thank you, Dr. Jacob John. Thank you, Dr. Rajiv. Thank you, Dr. Shaika. Thank you very much on behalf of GCCMC. Thank you all participants. Due to lack of time, we are not able to take your further questions, but anything you can please send it over a mail so that if panelists are keen, they can respond back to you. Thank you very much.
Thank you all.
Thank you all. Thank you.
Everyone, good night. Have a safe day.
Thank you.
Thank you.